so that those who missed the report can have a copy of it and can listen. After Paul and Barnabas had left Antioch and had come back, in Acts the 14th chapter in verse 27 it says, "And when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all things that God had done with them, and that he had opened a door of faith unto the Gentiles." I have seen churches where they were reluctant to have the preacher address the congregation about work elsewhere in the world that had been done. And they felt like a sermon was to be preached, and that's all they had the authority to assemble for. Well, this was the assembly in Acts 14:27, and during that assembly, Paul and Barnabas rehearsed what had happened with them in their journeys and the churches they had established, and those who had become Christians and the Gentiles turning to God. And I hope this will be encouraging to you, it will be edifying to you, and you will become more aware of the fruit which increaseth to your account. That's what Paul said to the church at Philippi in their supporting him. And he pictured it as God keeping books, and where there were people converted by the Apostle Paul, when they had been supporting Paul, it was in effect the Lord putting down to the account of the church at Philippi those saints who had turned to the Lord. And I want you to be aware that what we have been able to engage in recent years, one whole year, 5 weeks before that, and now this month, did not happen without you. And I'm aware of that, and happily tell everyone wherever I go that. I suppose it could have been done with the support of others. It has been especially pleasing to me that it was done with your support. You have been a good example to other churches. Other preachers have been doing the same thing that I did here, and up until that point, I do not know that hardly ever happened, if ever. And as a result, we have preachers going many places in the world where they were not in the past. And as I speak tonight, I want you to know that you should be aware of what you've accomplished. And in many of the things, I'm going to, of course, be using the first person. And this is not without knowledge that we have done this as partners. I'm reticent to just tell how wonderful I have been and what a great work I have done, and Marlene with me. But I learned something after several years of marriage. Used to, when some accolade would come my way, or some compliment would come my way, or some note would be taken my work, I never would tell Marlene. It was embarrassing to me. And I just felt like, it's not that important. Don't glory in this. And it occurred to me finally that she was missing something. The reason it occurred to me is because something came up and I said, yes, that's right. She said, why didn't you tell me? Or some such scenario. And I relayed about how reticent I was to do such things. She says, don't you know how happy it makes me? And I'm your partner, and I really share in that, and I want to know those things. So I got to where I could tell her things. And I hope after being married to you for about 80 years that I can tell you things and you understand, and you will take pleasure in them, in the things that we have shared together. In Romans, the 16th chapter, Paul names, I think, 26 different people that he once saluted in the church at Rome. He was noticing Christians, and he was noticing them by name. And plus that, he mentions Phoebe by name. And he mentions the church that met in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. And he mentions certain brethren that were associated with other brethren whom he named in that text. So I do not feel bad this evening if I name some names to you, and if I tell you about some Christians and what they are doing. And the whole thing ought to be as encouraging to us as I think it must have been encouraging to the church at Antioch when Paul and Barnabas came back to them and reported all the things that had taken place. It was a terribly busy month. I've left my appointment book back there. You might just like to take a look at it and see what things took place. Also, I have relabeled the pictures. It got smeared and you couldn't read what was on the back of the pictures. So if you'd like to look at the pictures again, these are a few representative pictures. Obviously, we have more. And I've got to tell you, the first roll I took was magnificent. The best pictures I've ever taken in my life, artistically composed, the most interesting subjects you've ever seen. And it got to the 24th frame, and I got 25. I do that occasionally. It went to 26. I think one time I got 26. And it went to 27. I said, something's wrong, and I opened it up, and there was no film there. But we took a second roll, but of course in very, very busy times, and so we didn't get many pictures taken, but you can see some scenes, and the one I'm especially pleased with is we got a picture of the congregation, and you will recognize Martin. Maybe he's sitting way back in the back, and Joseph, you remember, you met two of the Christians in Prague, and he's on the front row seated by Marlene. So take a look at the pictures again, and it'll give you some flavor of the work that was there. How busy we were is depicted by the fact that Marlene wanted to go down to Charles Bridge, which was built in the 1300s, and it is wide enough for automobiles to drive across and meet one another, but it's now a footbridge. It's a stone bridge, and it's a long bridge, but it is just used for people to walk back and forth across the Vltava River. And Marlene wanted to go down and throw her cane from the Charles Bridge in the Vltava River and leave her cane in Prague. And next to the last night, something came up and we didn't get to. And then the last night, we were so busy that we didn't get to do it either. So she brought her cane. I don't know if it's going to be the same throwing it in the Hudson River or if we might get arrested for that or not. I don't think that's quite going to be like leaving her cane in Prague. She was disappointed about that, but there was just no time to do it. In fact, it started hectically. We landed at 12:10 p.m. after 17 hours of travel, and Mike Morrow had a class set up for me at 7 o'clock that evening with a Seventh-day Adventist to study. Mike has no mercy, but Mike is one of the most valuable workers there. He has not preached publicly the gospel of Jesus Christ, but he has studied. He has become not only an effective worker, but knowledgeable and probably as effective as any teacher that exists in the Czech Republic at the present time. I cannot say enough about his work and his value to the work. And Libby was saying today, back in the early days of this country, there are books written about the beginning of people returning to the Lord and the establishment of his church in this nation, and there are certain names mentioned. And surely when that is written, the history of the Czech Republic and the gospel in that part of the world, Mike Morrow's name is going to have to appear in those pages and the work that he has done. And there are a lot of tales that can be told about Mike, and I don't have time to tell you all of those. But that's the way it started. In all, I taught 53 separate classes besides the 2 series of lecture, one on Catholicism and one on the theory of evolution. And most of the time it was 1 student at a time, but several times we had 2 students at a time. One time we may have had 3 students at a time. And I started off saying, okay, I'll just teach every day. Sunday would be busy because we'd worship in Prague Sunday morning and then go to one of these other cities on Sunday evening by train. And you'll see a picture of the trains that would take us. But after the first week, I agreed with Mike, no, he did have mercy there. No classes on Saturdays. We're going to take Saturdays off and relax and run around some. I don't know that that was physically relaxing, but it certainly was mentally relaxing, and it was refreshing. One was baptized while we were there. It was one of Mike's students, a young man active in the Salvation Army. Most that we were studying with were new students. We were studying with some old students. Some of these will become Christians. If you remember my reports, I was there working at this same pace for 4 months before I baptized the first one. And then in quick succession, 4 others followed, then Joseph followed. And then after we came back here, 4 other students of mine were baptized. So I suspect the same thing will happen here from some of those we left, that even though just one was baptized during that month, Some of the ones we taught will also be baptized in the coming weeks. Here are the churches in the Czech Republic and the one in Slovakia. Of course, there's the church in Prague. One of the men we baptized was in the army at that time. If you remember the stories that I wrote you about the soldiers, he was one of them. And he moved to České Budějovice and was working there. And there was a convert or two made, and he decided he wanted to work full time. So even though he was a mechanical engineer and a German company had just bought that company, which would have secured his future, he bought out his contract because they had paid for his schooling, and he began preaching there, and the church in Prague is fully supporting Miro. And the first Sunday, we met with the church of Prague. On Sunday morning, we got onto a train and traveled to České Budějovice and met with the Christians there. There are 5 Czechs there. Another of the converts in Prague moved back home to Pardubice. He converted his brother, who was a Jehovah's Witness. They converted some other Jehovah's Witnesses. A young man moved there from Searcy, Arkansas, where my parents are, and worked for 6 months, and others were baptized. The second Sunday, we worshiped Prague Sunday morning, got on a train, traveled to Pardubice, and there were 13 Czechs meeting there. We have isolated Christians at Olomouc, Brno, and Taboro. Aroma, I'm finally getting used to doing that. You have to have a very athletic tongue to speak Czech. There's just begun a new church in Hradec Králové, and of course there's a church down there in Bratislava. 2 years and 2 months ago, there was not a Christian in Czechoslovakia. And all of this has resulted since that time. Attendance in Prague averaged between 28 and 32. I think there were 28 present the day I took the picture, and there were 3 Christians absent, and their names are listed on the back. They were out of town. So that's what's happened in that part of the world, and it is something I think that we can just rejoice in. Once in a while, things like that happen here. Jeff was reporting on his work, and this evening, after I'm finished, I'm going to ask Charles to tell you a bit about his work and some good things that have happened there where he is. There is simply a lot to rejoice about, and we have had some converts, some have held on, some haven't here in the last year or so, but there are things for us to do at the same time. And Jeff mentioned, and it's been true of every work I've been in, we'll hit a period where it's just flat and it seems like nothing happens, and all of a sudden the work you've been doing pays off, and there are a lot of responses, and sometimes it goes for a while and then sometimes it goes flat again. And I'm confident that there are things here for us to accomplish. There are people for us to bring to the Lord. And as we mentioned in Bible study class, it's time for us to stop crying about the conditions in the world. Lament. I don't know if there's a difference between crying and lament. Maybe crying has more whining, and lamenting is just exercising real sorrow about the conditions in the world. But there's something we can do about it, and that is to live as Christians in this world, not become so attached to this world we're afraid for people to know we are Christians. And the testimony of our lives can have great effect and great power, and that will happen. We will lead others to Jesus Christ here, because the worse things become, it may take the bulk of the people with them down that broad way, which most of the people go and always have and did in the days of Jesus Christ. But there will be people who are aching, who are seeking, who are seeing the dire straits we are in, and who will welcome the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we must be there ready to do that. There is a mood change in Czechoslovakia, more in Prague than the outlying areas. We're finding that contacts are easier to be made now than they are in Prague. Those contacts may be slowing down a little bit. Mike can still average about 1 contact an hour when he's set up in public places with his table. But Prague is Athens. It's the cultural and arts center of the country, maybe of Europe. And you would not expect the gospel to be popular there, though we have, of course, had some remarkable success in Prague, but right after the wall came down in Germany, a profound effect took place in East Germany. Before the wall came down, what churches existed were full and were seen as a vehicle of revolution. But when the wall came down, all the East Germanies then could see is what West Germany had, and the church attendance began to dwindle there, and all they could think of was the material things there without. Well, now, after the giddy days of early freedom are over for the Czechs, and the hard realities of personal responsibility are setting in that come with freedom, they are looking about and seeing the things they do not have and how far behind they are the other Western countries, and there is more of a secular attitude developing, I suppose not secular, but more of a materialistic attitude developing. Someone asked me one time right after I got back, after Marlene and I had been over there for a year, and we'd told of the things that had happened, and they said, will that continue? And my answer was no. I thought it would slow down because of what I've just told you, and we've seen that happen, but the cause is planted there. There are active Christians there. They are working, and they're going to bring others to Christ, and I expect it to grow. In the other outlying cities, and these aren't small cities, there will be a great deal of progress made. For instance, in 7 or 8 months, 13 new Christians here in Pardubice. And that's a city of about 100,000. Hradec Karlova must be a city of about 500,000. Brno, probably 200,000. Tabor and Český Budějovice. Český Budějovice probably has over 100,000 people. So there's a lot of work left to be done. Not only did I go over for the purpose of teaching these classes, but also, of course, for the lectures I told you about. I was really satisfied with the number of visitors we had. In fact, I was really pleased with the number of visitors we had. The Czechs weren't. They just thought from the work they had done in advertising that everybody in the city ought to be there. They had rented a nice roomy auditorium and a beautiful building and spent a great deal of money. And probably if the Americans had done more of the advertising themselves, and this is not blaming them, I think I would have made the choice they did, we might have attracted more people. But they thought it best, since the Czechs wanted to do it and thought they ought to do it, to let the Czechs do the bulk of the advertising. And that may pay off more in the long run because they had to do it. I remember one Wednesday evening after a Bible study, walking outside the YMCA where the church meets, and we went down to Nemysty Republiky, which is one of the big squares in the city, and there were a couple of Christians. Well, there was a Christian and a contact, and here they were passing out advertisements for the lectures, and it was a delight to see them do that. I think we ended up saying 28 visitors from Prague for the first lecture on Catholicism. We also had Christians from the other places who came and attended, and though the auditorium was not full, there were enough people there for it to look respectable. And there was a lady who came the first night. I mean, she sat right on the front. That's one thing about the Czechs. When they come in, the back seats don't appeal to them. I mean, they want to be right there in the middle of it and up front, and that's where they were. And she started attending services the next Sunday, and unless she missed a day, she didn't miss a service after that. And though nobody has begun studying with her, she lives right next door to Mike, we found out. What a coincidence that was, because later we saw her on a tram riding and found out she lived there in the neighborhood. And so Mike will study with her, and I would not be surprised by what she obeys the gospel of Jesus Christ. One amusing thing happened the first night when I was lecturing on Catholicism. There was a man who looked just like Salman Rushdie. He's the one who wrote the book that Islam considers an insult, and I don't know whether it is or not. It probably is. And they put out a contract on his life, and he's in hiding most of the time. Well, I think he listened to my Catholicism lecture, half of it. No, the fellow looked just like him. And he got weary with it halfway through. He didn't like what he was hearing, so he was sitting about where Jack is, only closer to the edge. And he just stood up out there and took a long time straightening his coat out and getting comfortable and picking up his other coat and looking at it, and then it must have taken that guy 5 minutes to leave the auditorium. But I was watching everybody else, and occasionally somebody glanced at him, but he didn't detract if that's what he was trying to do, and that he was really making a protest in his movements. And finally he left, and it was no harm done. We had an interesting question and answer session afterwards. I alienated certain Protestants who were there, and that was a mistake I didn't make the second night, because I talked about apostolic succession, and that there was no apostolic succession. There could have been no one to succeed Peter, even if he had been bishop at Rome. And of course, there was a Seventh-day Adventist preacher present, and when you remember Ellen G. White and her position as a prophet, he took exception to some things we said and was irritated. And there was another evangelical preacher, and he was a little upset at the same idea, because they believe they have their apostles in their church. And so the first two questions came from those guys, and they didn't just ask a question. And people who had seen things like this in the city before say, no, the Czechs want to make a speech. So they would stand up and make a speech, and you just having to sit there and say, you have a question? And finally they would get to the question. But after we cleared them away, we got some questions from Catholics. Some Catholics came. There were two young men who were training for the priesthood. And they had sat and made their notes. And of course, one of the things I did in introduction was just to say, look, the Catholics don't follow the Bible. And we went to the thing about call no man your father, and the bishops were married and had to have faithful children. And so the two young men who were training for the priesthood decided to take on the question about father. And the first young man said, well, we call our earthly parents father. And I said, well, yes, the Bible does that also in Ephesians, the 6th chapter and verse 2. Honor thy father and thy mother. And the verse 4 says, Father, provoke not your children to wrath. But Jesus was not talking about that. He was talking about religious titles. Well, he talked on a while, and then back and forth, and he made his speeches, and he sat down. So his brother stood up, and he said, well, would you agree with Paul and Stephen? And I couldn't think of what he had in mind with Stephen, but of course you'd have to say yes. So I said yes, but then when he started his passages, I thought, oh, he's made a mistake. It's Paul and Timothy that he is speaking of. So turn with me to a passage, and here was his argument. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. And besides this, Paul calls Timothy in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2, my true child, my child in the Lord. This is what Paul says writing to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 14 beginning. I write not these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For though you have 10,000 tutors in Christ, yet have you not many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I begat you through the gospel. So he said here, Paul is described as a father to the Corinthians. And of course, we allowed as how that was correct. This was a figurative expression of a spiritual relationship, but that does not justify wearing the name or wearing the title father. And I asked him upon what basis he felt like he could call anybody father in religion. And he said, well, Paul converted them so they could call him father. And of course we came back, but Paul didn't wear the title father. And then I asked this question, what does Pope mean? And he knew, of course, that meant father. And you call the Pope father? And he said yes. And I said, did the Pope convert you? And he said no. And I said, why do you call him father then? And it was classic. He just stood there and froze and didn't say anything. But you have to be careful, because if you make them look too bad, the Czechs have a great sense of fairness. And it wasn't going to look good if this American beat up on a Czech. So I tried to gracefully let him off that, but I did let it just carry on long enough to make the point that he was making an argument that it wouldn't stand. He had nothing to say to it, and then we went on. And I think eventually it had a very good effect. Then, what have I got? Neighbor. Well, I've already told you about her who came. To go to the evolution lectures, I was pleased with them. And we had people there who were evolutionists both nights, and we had questions come from the audience, and we had some people who I think were there sincerely to investigate, and I hope it was helpful to them. And it was instructive, I think, to the Christians and some people I knew who were on the fence. The second night we had Joseph present. He is a plant pathologist and a geneticist, a first rank in this world. We had another Czech geneticist. Is that right? Doesn't sound right now, but that's what he was, however that word's said. And he was present, and when he came in, he told one of the ushers, he said, I am a believer, but I am also an evolutionist. And he gave the young man his card, and the young man brought me his card, so I knew who he was. And besides him, we had a doctor there who is a heart surgeon that I had been studying with. So I had those to speak to, and I am just a preacher. I'm not a scientist, even though I have had some biological training. And I was confident of my material, but I wondered how I was going to fare in the question and answer session with all those people. And the geneticist started off taking notes like crazy. And I said, oh man, he's going to ask some questions that are tough. And then I went through a review of the first night where we showed there is no way that science can indicate any mechanism whereby life can come from non-life, yet they believe it has happened. That's faith. And there's no mechanism whereby you can get from alligators to birds, and yet they believe that has happened. That's faith. And then I got to the fossil record. When I started on the fossil record, his pen just froze, and he listened raptly. And he just, for the rest of the time, and I spoke for nearly 2 hours that night, and he listened intently to everything I said. And when it was over, he had only one comment. He had understood it, and I don't think anyone else understood it. It might have been in the translation or something, but that I had indicated that people of the ancient past, whom I think are human beings, could not have mated with modern man, or people of different races couldn't mate. And he wanted to clarify that, and I said, yes, I believe that. And that's one of my points about these so-called prehistoric men. I believe they could have mated with people today, and that satisfied him, and he didn't ask any more questions, and he didn't challenge anything else. And I was pleased with the material because Joseph said, you know, we were taught this thing in secondary school and in high school, and we paid not much attention to it after that. We took it for granted, but he said, you did an effective job of showing the weaknesses in that position, and the things you said were very helpful to me. And I had made the point in the lesson that there is a considerable number, there's a bunch of scientists who don't believe in evolution, but they quietly go about their work, and quoted a statement of an evolutionist acknowledging that, because those scientists think that the theory is too well entrenched to even challenge. So they go about the work improving our lives and improving this planet and disregarding it. And it ends up Joseph is one of those, though he'd taken it for granted and never looked at it to examine whether it is so or not. And so if that helps Joseph in that country with his standing, and if this other geneticist should be persuaded to at least not accept it, no telling the good that can come in the scientific community in that nation. And there's this physics professor that we studied with also, and Mike gave him a book on evolution, challenging it, and he is circulating it among his faculty. And they are reading it with relish. So I'm really pleased with what is happening in that realm. So I enjoyed those. It was a lot of work. I went not totally prepared because just before I went, if you remember, there was April 15th and income taxes. And that delayed some of my preparation. But I had my materials, and all I had to do was compile them and get them organized because I had at least got that much done, and I knew the material that I wanted to cover. And I was pleased with the way things came out, and I hope a lot of good came from those. The heart surgeon, he just did not believe in God. He said, this is a hard concept for me. He said, for all my entire life, I've been taught there is no God, and I've been taught the theory of evolution. And he had been given all sorts of reasons not to believe. He wasn't especially antagonistic to the idea, but it was just incomprehensible. But we studied to the point, I think, to where he is leaning, in fact, he's doing more than leaning toward the idea that God is, and there's beginning to be a yearning in his heart. And one day we had studied evidences, and then finally he said, I've been reading the Bible, and I've been reading, I guess it was Luke, and he said, do I have to really hate my life in order to be a Christian? So we talked about how the word hate is used in the sense of loving less, and then went to a passage that talked about loving life. And you're familiar with this passage. It's 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, beginning in verse 10, where the text says, he that would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord upon the righteous, and his ears unto their supplication. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. He said, that is profoundly beautiful language. And the thought is wonderful. And at the conclusion of the lesson, he says, I thank you for your explanation. I understand the relative importance then of spiritual things and physical things, and which if I become a Christian, I must put first. I hope to hear that he becomes a Christian. He really was a nice person. I enjoyed meeting him and I enjoyed studying with him. But that has to do mostly with the lectures, and I've mentioned some personal material. And I want to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the students. And I'm not going to talk about many. Maybe I'll use them as illustrations in lessons from time to time. But I want to tell you about Dasha. Dasha's field is biology, and she loves biology. And she was an atheist, and she didn't believe in God. And though she had come to respect the brethren there, yet it would really rankle her if she were strongly challenged. And so we studied with her, and then one time we were studying with her and another young mother-to-be. She's about to have her first child. And so I was addressing most of my remarks to the young mother-to-be, and all of a sudden Dasha just kept getting in the conversation and challenging things. And so I just turned my attention to her and said, it's time to nail this young lady to the wall. Of course, I didn't mean I was going to get brutal or anything, but I was pretty firm and just started in one point after another, and went through this material about the spiritual realm here and the physical realm here, and we only get information through our senses. If you remember that argument, if you don't, I'll make it again sometime. And sometimes I like for you to forget, so I get to make an argument, and you think that's wonderful all over again. But at any rate, went through that with her finally sitting there quietly listening, and when I got through, this was having to be translated, and she said to the translator, and these were the words of the translator to me, that is a very clear explanation. I can see the necessity for God's existence. The victory is yours. I don't know if I have ever had anybody just that openly admit they were wrong under pressure. And she was under pressure, and it's not because she was weak in character. I mean, this was a hard-headed young lady and an able young lady. But she saw it, she faced it, and she did have a question, though, about Archaeopteryx. That's that bird you usually see in the textbooks that has claws on its wings, and it has some features in its head supposedly that look like a rodent, and the spine continues down its tail, which isn't characteristic of very many birds. And she wanted to know about that. I said it was a bird. It has feathers. And of course, now we have found, even using the evolutionary time scale, what evolutionists recognize as true birds 60 million years by their time scale before Archaeopteryx. So this cannot be a stepping stone between birds and reptiles when birds, easily recognized as birds, existed far before that. But the subject was dropped there, and I saw her the next evening. And she came to me and she said, I apologize, you were right. I looked it up in the book, and Archaeopteryx did have feathers. So you can see something of the integrity of that young lady, and this I think will impress you, but it won't impress you as much not having been in Prague. There is not a shred of modesty about most Prague women. That is just something foreign to their culture. and she was approached about being a model. So she talked it over with her mother, who is remotely connected with the business, and her mother says, Dasha, if you're a model, this is what you're going to have to deal with, this is what you're going to have to deal with, and this is what you're going to have to deal with. And Dasha looked at the lifestyle, and she looked at the immorality that she would be connected with, and she said no. Now, jobs in Prague that pay a lot of money are rather scarce. And she could have made a lot of money with this. And Dasha, who was an atheistic evolutionist, said no, because there was just that basic decency in her. And you've already seen her integrity. And after the lectures on evolution, by the way, there was a journalist present who had stood and challenged and asked several questions. And afterward, Dasha was over talking to him, and I said, oh no, Dasha's going over there, she's getting all sorts of material. And someone came up to me later and says, Dasha's up there fighting against evolution and defending creation. So we did not get to have our last session with Dasha. We had a conflict in schedule, but the report was that Dasha is coming around, and Dasha likely is to become a Christian, and I expect any week to hear that she is. I want to tell you one story. I don't remember if you remember all the Georges that I first wrote about. I first worked there. We had George the doctor, George the geologist, George the metro worker, George the architect. We had 6 Georges. And that's the way we identified them. And that's the way we still identify the Czechs. Their last names are really tough. And we've got 2 Yanas. We've got Yana red hair and Yana glasses. I mean, the one with the glasses is a pretty girl, but I mean, her glasses are very distinct. And now the Czechs have started referring to one another that way. There's Yana red hair and Yana glasses. But this time it was Pavel's, which in America would be Paul. And the heart surgeon's name was Pavel. I studied with 2, maybe 3 other Pavels this particular time. And maybe this guy's name was Pavel, this journalist that Dasha stood up to. But anyhow, George the geologist has not become a Christian. Evolution had been a problem for him. I think he might have become a Christian, but he's married and his wife is really pulling back. But I have hopes for them. It may take a year or 2, but they may even obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. They invited us over, and we spent an evening with them. They had been to the States for Camp America. Camp America gets volunteers from European countries, and they bring them and put them in all sorts of camps, taking care of needy people and various things here in the U.S. And then they have about 6 weeks after that on their own. They can go home, or if they've got the funds, they can stay here and tour the U.S. Well, George and Miriam had a few funds, so they spent it on renting a car. And they would sleep in the car, and they had a tent, and where they could, they would sleep in a tent at night, so they weren't going to pay motel bills. They would buy dry cereal and eat it out of the box, and once in a while they would buy meat. And the cheapest thing they could buy is bacon when it cost less than $1, and they wouldn't buy it unless it cost less than $1. And I said, well, how did you cook it? He said, cook it? We ate it raw. How did you stand there? He said, oh, it was tough. And he said, sometimes you'd be chewing on one end, the other end would be down your throat. And his wife says, yeah, it was tough, and if we do that again, we could take scissors the next time. So Marlene told them about Spam and suggested that'd be a better buy, and they'd get more food value from that. But that's how they lived for 6 weeks. I mean, they lost weight, but they have a magnificent series of pictures of the United States. They've been places I have not been. They've got photographs that surpass my photographs. But they fasted mostly in that time, eating just what they had to. And I hope that young couple obeys the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, I'm not going to tell you about any more right now except one. I've got to tell you about Alena. She was the psychologist that we baptized. She may have been the last one we baptized before we left Czechoslovakia. She was a translator for us, and I always enjoyed Alena translating. She's the one where we were going back and forth with the student, and all of a sudden the student and the translator are talking. And I said, Alena, and this is before Alena was a Christian, I said, what was that about? She said, oh, she asked a question, but I've heard you answer it so many times, I just went ahead and answered it. I said, no, we don't do it like that. And she is a spunky woman, but she's a little flaky. Now, I love her. I really do. And she is a wonderful person, one of our favorite people over there. But she's just flaky. That's all there is to say about it. And I think it's because she's a psychologist, or maybe she's a psychologist because she's a little flaky. But she worries and she frets. If she would just take her own advice, she could solve a lot of her worrying. And I can tell you some things she's worried about, but I'll save that for private conversations or whatever sometime. But to give you one example, after our last session, I thanked her and told her how much I appreciated the work she had done for us. And she was embarrassed by that, so when it came time to say goodbye, and we're standing in the vestibule of Mike's apartment, she said, well, you know. And I said, yeah, I know. She says, yeah, we know. And we said goodbye, and I knew what she meant. There were all sorts of things she wanted to say, but she just wasn't free to say them. She was too uptight to say them. So Mike walked her down to the front door. 4 flights, that was good for Marlene's foot. And when Mike came up, he said, Alana said, how can I tell them how much I love them? And Mike said, well, just tell them. You're a psychologist. You ought to know how to do that. And she says, I can't do that. And so Mike says, okay, I'll tell them for you. She says, oh, would you please? So that's a psychologist. And she really has a lot of insight, and she's helpful to me understanding the students. And I think there was a time when she probably softened something I said, maybe not the words, but in the way I said it. I was talking to this journalist, and we wasted our last night talking to this guy for 2.5 hours. He didn't want to believe, he wasn't interested. It ended up, he just wanted Christians to respect his unbelief and admit that he might be right about some things and get off his back. And he made all sorts of weird arguments about the Bible. He misunderstood the Bible. There were false accusations. He misrepresented the Bible. And so I finally just asked him, you don't want to believe. Why don't you want to believe? And he said, I don't want any rules in my life. So we pointed out the folly of that. And he admitted, well, yeah, some rules are necessary, but he wanted to make the rules. And I said, what are you going to do with these rules? He said, well, pass them on to my children and my children's children. And I said, why? If you won't take anybody else's rules, why should they take your rules? And then I let in on one of these tirades. And I said, you're the most arrogant person I've ever seen. Here you don't want anybody making rules for you, and you want to make rules for your children and your grandchildren. And I quoted from Julius Caesar on what meat have you been eating that you're so... I can't even remember the quotation now, but I think I was irritated enough that I got the quotation right at that time. And all is just translating all of this, but in a nice, sweet, gentle voice. And we ended up parting as friends. And I said, yeah, we can be friends. I don't mind being friends with you, but don't expect me to respect the things you believe in your disbelief and criticism of the Bible. I don't. If you expect me to tell you that you're all right and you have something that is respectable belief, I don't believe that. And so we ended friends anyhow, and it may be that Alana helped that because she spoke in her nice, soft voice. I really wasn't angry, but I felt like he deserved some straight words, and I gave them to him. I guess I need to ask Alana, what did you say to that guy so that he didn't get ready to fight? But anyhow, that's Alana, the psychologist. Well, this will give you some glimpse of what was done. And you can look at the pictures, you can look at the appointment book. And it was a month well spent, and I thank you for supporting me in our going there. It was really worthwhile doing. I appreciate the work you did while I was gone, and those who taught classes and those who preach. If there's somebody here not a Christian, if the Czechs can see the need for becoming a Christian, surely with all you've heard about Jesus Christ, you have need to believe that he's the Son of God and he can save you from your sins. And if you would obey him, why don't you come to the Lord, and come now while together we stand and sing. Prince of Peace, control